Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 14 April 2025. It is the 134th anniversary of the birth of Vere Gordon Childe, better known to posterity as V. Gordon Childe, who was born in Sydney, Australia, 134 years ago on this date in 1892. In several episodes, I've talked about those like Robert Heilbronner and Herman Kahn, who extended historical consciousness into the future. About the same time as historical consciousness was being extended into the future, others were extending historical consciousness into the past. Both of these developments, into the past and into the future, began in earnest in the 19th century. The earliest science fiction dates from the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, with some of the earliest futurism, like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, dating to about the same time. Also in the 19th century, Charles Lyell extended geology into deep historical time, and after Lyell, Darwin similarly extended biology into deep historical time. Lyell was anticipated by James Hutton in the 18th century, and we can always find earlier hints of this development of historical consciousness if we look for them. Nicholas Steno, for example, formulated the geological laws of superposition in the 17th century, long before the work of either Hutton or Lyell. Darwin had implied of his book that it had served as a kind of catalyst for the reorganization of knowledge. Quote, innumerable well-observed facts were stored in the minds of naturalists, ready to take their proper places as soon as any theory which would receive them was sufficiently explained, unquote. Not only was this true for biology, it was also true for human prehistory, and it immediately began to reshape our understanding of human prehistory. A naturalistic conception of human beings means that innumerable and well-observed facts stored in the minds of naturalists could now take their proper places in the natural history of man, and that's what happened. Only 4 years after the first edition of Darwin's On the Origin of Species appeared in 1859, Charles Lyell himself published Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man in 1863. Lyell continued to distance himself from Darwin's position, but it seems unlikely that this book would have been written, and unlikely that it would have been as widely read as it was had it not been for the prior success of Darwin's book. With Darwin and Lyell placing human beings within natural history, we immediately see that human history is a small fragment of a larger natural history. And the more we learn of prehistory, the more we become aware that human prehistory is a much, much longer period than human history in the narrow sense. In a broader sense, human history is the sum total of traditional history and prehistory, and our historical consciousness of deep time sees history whole in this more comprehensive sense of history. V. Gordon Childe was among the most eminent of the early prehistorians, seeking to provide this larger prehistorical context for human history. And though Childe pushed the limits of prehistory further back into time than had hitherto been possible, he was himself a man of his time. Like many of his contemporaries in the sciences, Childe was a Marxist. Being from Australia, he isn't counted among the British scientific Marxists, but he was their contemporary and reflected some of their mixed scientific and ideological interests. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley was an exception to this rule, as I mentioned in my episode on him. It's odd that the idea of prehistory should have been brought to prominence by a Marxist like Childe, given Marx's own skepticism of prehistory. Despite Marx's historical materialism, he's still sufficiently enthralled to the German idealist tradition to point to the point of denying the very possibility of prehistory. In the German Ideology, Marx wrote, quote, We recognize immediately the spiritual ancestry of the great historical wisdom of the Germans who, when they run out of positive material and when they can serve up neither theological nor political nor literary rubbish, assert that this is not history at all, but the prehistoric era. They do not, however, enlighten us as to how we proceed from this nonsensical prehistory to history proper, though, on the other hand, in their historical speculation, they seize upon this prehistory with a special eagerness because they imagine themselves safe there from interference on the part of crude facts, and at the same time, because they can give full rein to their speculative impulse and set up and knock down hypotheses by the thousand. Unquote. Obviously, Marx was talking about a speculative prehistory, not tied to facts in the way that archaeology is tightly coupled with facts, but the disdain that you can hear in this passage is obvious. And I have to wonder if Marx was thinking about Kant's essay from 1786, Speculative Beginning of Human History, which was openly and explicitly speculative on matters that were then without any body of empirical knowledge to support them. Childe wasn't dissuaded from prehistory by Marx's disdain. In fact, he went on to show how prehistory could be firmly based on what Marx called crude facts. It took some time for Childe's factually based prehistory to be recognized for what it is. And what it is isn't the kind of speculation that Marx derided, but another kind of history based on another kind of evidence. Prehistory is history before history, usually identified by traditional historians as all history prior to written record. The traditional view of history is represented in Dr. Johnson's Table Talk, which records a remark about the earliest history of Britain. Quote, all that is really known of the ancient state of Britain is contained in a few pages. We can know no more than what the old writers have told us. Yet what large books we have upon it, the whole of which is all a dream, unquote. For Dr. Johnson, and for many others, we have only the records of earlier historians from which to construct our histories. Even while Dr. Johnson was saying this, however, the auxiliary sciences of history were coming into being. Antiquarians were studying coins for the information stamped on them, which was the origins of numismatics, and inscriptions were being systematically transcribed, constituting the origins of epigraphy. Gibbon wrote in his memoirs about purchasing the memoirs of the Academy of Inscriptions, which was originally tasked with finding monuments, coins, medals, and inscriptions that could be useful as models for celebrating the French court, but which institution imperceptibly transitioned into historical scholarship. Gibbon wrote, quote, I cannot forget the joy with which I exchanged a banknote of £20 for the 20 volumes of the memoirs of the Academy of Inscriptions. Nor would it have been easy by any other expenditure of the same sum to have procured so large and lasting a fund of rational amusement, unquote. The auxiliary sciences grew to include the study of seals and flags, stamps and insignia, genealogy and heraldry, place names and proper names. Eventually, the auxiliary disciplines included archaeology, and the scientific development of archaeology went on to transform our understanding of human history, including human prehistory. Since the traditional methods of historical research are all based on written sources, this means that the prehistorian must employ non-traditional methods. This non-traditionalism of archaeology was probably one of the reasons historians were slow to acknowledge the extension of history beyond written sources. Archaeology involves a research methodology that is fundamentally distinct from the study of texts. It is, for example, social, even communal, in its organization of effort. Historians can write a history in splendid isolation as long as they have access to a library. Archaeology, on the other hand, requires a team of individuals. The social character of archaeology has only increased over time as additional specialists have joined excavation so as to derive more knowledge from a site. The archaeologist John Romer, comparing the contemporary world to ancient Egypt, said that we today don't know what it's like to work in community, but archaeologists work in community of necessity. Archaeology populates prehistory with the crude facts that Marx denied to prehistory, but which Childe furnished for us. The Oxford English Dictionary provides a citation from 1871 as the first instance of the use of the word prehistory from Edward Burnett Tyler's Primitive Culture, in which Tyler wrote, quote, "The history and prehistory of man take their proper places in the general scheme of knowledge," unquote. Another early prehistorian was Lewis Henry Morgan, and in particular his 1877 book, Ancient Society. Morgan formulated a taxonomy of human societies, but he did so in a language not used today, and so his work is viewed with a certain embarrassment today. In particular, Morgan distinguished among savagery, barbarism, and civilization as stages in social development. We've become accustomed to seeing the terms savagery and barbarism used to convey a valuation rather than a description. But Morgan assigned specific achievements to each social taxon, further subdividing savagery into lower, middle, and upper savagery, and similarly dividing barbarism into lower, middle, and upper barbarism. So we have the lower status of savagery from the infancy of the human race to the commencement of the next period. That's what Lewis Henry Morgan says. The middle status of savagery, which he includes the use of fishing and the use of fire, and the upper status of savagery, which is the invention of the bow and arrow. Then the lower status of barbarism, from the invention of art to pottery. The middle status of barbarism, from the domestication of animals and the cultivation of maize by irrigation and the use of adobe brick. The upper status of barbarism, from the invention of the process of smelting iron ore with the first use of iron tools. And finally, the status of civilization, from the invention of the phonetic alphabet with the use of writing to the present time. This is pretty much straight up cultural evolutionism, which I've discussed in several episodes, in particular in my episode on Karl Marx. Cultural evolutionism is usually opposed to cultural relativism, the latter primarily having its origin in the work of Franz Boas and his disciples. Cultural evolutionism and cultural relativism are primarily concepts of anthropology and archaeology, and the relationship to philosophies of history can be ambiguous. Marx makes cultural evolutionism central to his philosophy of history, but we find the ambiguity in the overall Marxist tradition, since contemporary cultural Marxism insists on cultural relativism. Vere made a throwaway criticism of Husserl, that Husserl's was just another, what he called, three-stage philosophy of history. And insofar as there are three-stage philosophies of history that deserve to be dismissed with a hand wave, we can understand them as being forms of cultural evolutionism. That is to say, the three stages of history, one after another, are one precedes the next, and those are the stages in cultural evolutionism. And that is the vulgar reading of Hegel's distinction between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Fichte's philosophy of history, by the way, had 5 stages rather than 3, so he can't be hand-waved away as a philosopher, as a 3-stage philosopher of history. I think there's a tendency to see cyclical histories treated like forms of cultural evolutionism that reset with each cycle. That certainly seems to be what we have in ancient writers like Polybius. Spengler, however, is often called a cyclical theorist of history. There are also important elements of cultural relativism in Spengler. For Spengler, civilizations are incommensurable. They don't even have the same mathematics. So while each culture matures into a civilization and then begins its decline, and this diachronic structure is repeated across all civilizations, that is to say, the progress from origins to to culture, to civilization, to decline, everything else is relative to the individual civilization. So we can see that there's no straightforward equivalent of the distinction between cultural evolutionism and cultural relativism in philosophy of history. Childe, as an archaeologist and as a prehistorian, was closer to the social sciences than to philosophy of history. We don't find Childe discussing Spengler and Toynbee as Henry Frankfurt did. Marxism provided Childe with some ideas, but he wasn't at all rigid about it. Childe's book, What Happened in History, synthesizes a number of extant scenes of prehistory with his Marxist interests. He employs Morgan's social taxonomy of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, but he also combines it with Christian Jurgensen Thompson's three-age system, so that savagery was the use of stone tools, barbarism was marked by the emergence of metallurgy, the Copper Age, and then the Bronze Age, while civilizations proper appeared later in the Bronze Age and later made possible the Iron Age. Childe's Marxism is expressed in this book by his discussion of what he calls contradictions of the economies of these early societies. Childe also projected revolutions into the past, and perhaps his most influential contribution is his conception of the urban revolution. The urban revolution is Childe's term for the appearance, growth, and proliferation of cities. Childe produced a list of 10 criteria he employed as a diagnostic for an urban revolution. Childe's 10 criteria, which he called rather abstract, were 1, spatial extension and population density; 2, division of labor, that is to say, craft specialization; 3, surplus value transferred to social elites; 4, monumental architecture; 5, social stratification; 6, writing; 7, science; 8, art; 9, trade; and 10, prioritizing residence over kinship. Childe's list was taken up by other archaeologists and used to identify not only cities, but civilizations, which are then implicitly accepted as coextensive with the urban revolution. Childe's 10 criteria employed as a diagnostic to identify civilizations has been repeatedly discussed, applied, revised, and extended, and is still influential today. These criteria have been most influential among archaeologists since they were inspired by Childe's own archaeological work. The artifacts that Childe dug out of the ground were his guide to human history, and this gives to reconstructed prehistory a particular character. We can say that archaeology studies the material culture of human beings, and material culture has a specific meaning in archaeology. Material culture is defined in Barbara Ann Kipfer's Encyclopedic Dictionary of Archaeology as, quote, the artifacts and eco-facts used by a group to cope with the physical and social environment. Material culture includes the buildings, tools, and other artifacts that constitute the material remains of a former society, its technology and artifacts combined. Material culture thus embraces folk architecture, folk arts, and folk crafts. For example, the construction of houses, the design and decoration of buildings and utensils, and the performance of home industries according to traditional styles and methods make up material culture. The distinction is made between those aspects of culture that appear as physical objects and those aspects that are non-material. It is the major source of evidence for archaeology, unquote. What's strikingly absent in this description of material culture is anything spiritual. Of course, the spiritual dimension of human experience also leaves its traces in the archaeological record, so much so that it's a joke among archaeologists that any artifact for which no mundane explanation is obvious becomes a ritual object. This has led to many amusing confusions. Of course, The earliest written records are also often practical, recording tallies of foods produced, stored, and distributed. But there's also poetry and mythology. And these stories shape our understanding of peoples in ways that material culture can't communicate. So even though a comprehensive conception of history seeks to synthesize history, prehistory, and traditional history, there remains a division between the two. Reconstructed prehistory focuses on the ordinary business of life, while traditional history focuses on elites and what Robert Redfield called a great tradition. In James K. Feebleman's Technology and Reality, he discusses the neglect of technology and engineering by the elite classes who contributed to the great tradition, and among the Greeks, philosophers and scientists who formulated theories of the world. Observing the absence of a philosophy of technology until very recently, Feebleman wrote, quote, "Philosophers have commented on human behavior and inferentially on the work of man, for instance, architecture buildings that have been discussed in the theories of aesthetics. But nowhere has there been any mention of the abstract issues raised by the existence of the very visible activities of engineers. True, the results are often taken into account, but never how they came about. It is a very cardinal error of philosophy from the beginning to have ignored the material construction which makes the life of human culture possible." Unquote. Feebleman notes that architecture has been discussed widely, we could say, and we recall that Childe included monumental architecture as among the identifying properties of an urban revolution. This literary and philosophical self-image of a society has produced the greater part of the written documents that historians have used in composing their histories, and this has led to ellipses in history. For example, I just learned a few days ago that an intact Roman boiler was discovered at the Villa della Pisanella in Boscorial near Pompeii. The boiler still has its pipes and fittings and valves in place. I hadn't previously heard about this find. Archaeological discoveries like this make us aware that there was an entire technological infrastructure of the ancient world, probably employing a great many persons and used routinely every day by millions, but it's virtually absent from the written historical record. But it's this material culture that the methods of prehistory emphasize, while the material remains of high culture are ambiguous. So our prehistory is predominantly technological, while our history proper is literary. This is changing and will continue to change, but we run up against the limits of the evidence available to us, the limited record of material culture that the archaeologist unearths, and the limited record of high culture that traditional history has cultivated. For a philosopher who has a rigorously idealistic conception of history, none of these artifacts of material culture or Childe's marshaling of these artifacts to identify an urban revolution will be relevant to their thought, not the cashing out of prehistory in crude facts, and not the stretching of human history over the larger frame of natural history. But in a naturalistic context, these developments transform our understanding of time and history. I should point out that having a rigorously idealistic conception of history doesn't necessarily mean following the lead of, say, Berkeley or Kant or F.H. Bradley or J.M.E. McTaggart. Some recent idealist philosophers of history no longer typically seek to deny the reality of time or of the external world. Mostly it's become a matter of valuation. The value of the actual world is downplayed, while the value of the spiritual dimension of history is emphasized. Still, this usually takes the form of a devaluation of prehistory, especially in the sense of history prior to documents. As I've noted, traditional historians have defined history in terms of an historical period coincident with the appearance of written records, and this makes history a matter of the human mind and therefore an idealistic enterprise with or without the metaphysics of idealism. Philosophers have implicitly followed the lead of historians and have shown little interest in prehistory. There's no entry on either prehistory or philosophy of prehistory in any of the dictionaries or encyclopedias of philosophy that I happen to have to hand, and there are no entries on prehistory in the indices of the books I have on philosophy of history. Collingwood is a good example of a philosophical adaptation of the traditional view. Collingwood's conception of history as the reenactment of the thoughts of past historical actors is primarily based on being able to reconstruct these thoughts because we know what past historical actors have thought through their writing. This approach makes written history essential to history, effectively denying the possibility of prehistory. In a sense, this is odd because Collingwood himself was an archaeologist engaged in the archaeological reconstruction of the historical past, though he was mostly concerned with Roman Britain, which belongs to the historical period. So you could say to yourself that you were just filling in some details, but the real history, as it were, was not to be found in the artifacts. Still, we can't dismiss the possibility of reconstructing prehistorical thought. There is, in fact, a discipline that attempts to do this, known as cognitive archaeology. And notice that it's phrased as cognitive archaeology and not as cognitive history. It's possible that we could reconstruct the Collingwoodian approach to history for prehistory using the resources of cognitive archaeology. I've been working on something like this for several years. I think there is at least a possibility of constructing a bridge between non-metaphysical idealist philosophies of history and naturalistic philosophies of history. For a naturalistic philosophy of history, the recognition of prehistory is one of the most important developments in the history of historical thought. The extension of historical consciousness to the distant past and the distant future is the Copernican revolution that decenters us from the ancient presuppositions of human centrality and human exception. Telescoping human history within the much larger and longer context of natural history demonstrates the smallness of human history in the cosmos, just as the astronomical Copernican revolutions have demonstrated and continue to demonstrate the smallness of Earth in the cosmos. These are now familiar themes to us. In fact, they become so familiar that it surprises us to hear the other view, the view of the centrality of human experience, which was expressed, for example, by Frank Ramsey. Still, archaeology and prehistory are human, all too human, like all the sciences, and they have come into being to serve human needs and human desires. Human experience remains central in archaeology and prehistory, even if we don't always see it. I previously discussed the work of Vere Gordon Childe in my Thought Experiments in Civilization episode, In Search of Lost Civilizations. So if you're interested in more, you can check out that episode. Otherwise, happy birthday, Vere Gordon Childe, and thanks for listening.